what Robert and I were doing was calculating the distance using the actual video, and you can actually take the length of the rocket frame by frame and calculate the distance it's traveling through that. And that's been previously done, and the article is by Popov on the Hollis site as well. He's done the same thing and come out to approximately 11 miles was what it was doing at. Here's a calculator that you can get online to calculate your linear motion and your distance and time. And if you use that calculator and work out the height times downrange, and it keeps you underneath the clouds, because the clouds aren't going to be more than 6 miles high, and this is separating underneath the clouds approximately 11 miles down, and the speed that it would be traveling at is just under 500 miles an hour. This chart here shows you the speed of sound as it changes over height in the atmosphere, and with height and temperature in the atmosphere, showing you the speed of sound is going. And at no time has anyone ever recorded a sonic boom from crossing the speed of sound. If you go with the official version, it's going to be within under 20 seconds from launch. It takes about 12 seconds to clear the tower. After that, it has to accelerate. And within the next few seconds after that, there's going to be a sonic boom. If it's traveling at 6,000 miles an hour at 36 miles, even on that version, or 12,000 miles an hour at 42 miles up, there's going to be a sonic boom. And as you can see, the speed of sound here in the blue changes. It actually slows down as you go up. Here's meters per second down here, 250 to 350 right here, and it's just running under the 300 up in this range here. So the sonic boom would be there, very evident within 20 seconds after the launch. And at no time has any recording of a Saturn V rocket launching recorded a sonic boom.
And just to add to what Scott is saying, I mentioned in my initial presentation the launch of Apollo 6. And I just want to elaborate just a little bit more just to show how we arrived at this. Apollo 6, it's on record, they had serious pogo oscillations. The pogo oscillations, for the viewers that are watching, basically it's a vibration of the longitudinal axis of the rocket. So it's just severely vibrating. If there had to be astronauts on the rocket that day, they would have had to abort the mission. That's how bad that was. Now, NASA's given all kinds of indications and all kinds of guesses as to what was causing the fuel lines to break. Actually, this is very interesting. NASA doesn't admit to the F1 engines faltering, but it was the F1 engines that were faltering that actually caused the pogo effect. NASA says that the F1 engines were working perfectly, but that's not what I have read in many researchers who actually support the Apollo missions. I'll get to that in a second. But what's important to know is then NASA then says, oh, but just in case, we did make an adjustment to the F1 engines, and apparently they made those adjustments, and then 7 months later, they launched the first Saturn V manned mission, not only to low Earth orbit, but to circumnavigate the moon and back, and that was Apollo 8. So in 7 months from Apollo 6, and the almost disastrous mission of Apollo 6, in 7 months, they went to fixing the problems without any further testing of the F1 engines. And that really was a startling conclusion for me. Now, this is very interesting. I read this from a space historian from America in Space series. It's called Saturn V, America's Rocket to the Moon by Eugene Reichel. I'm sure if you look him up, he's a staunch NASA supporter. And there's a very interesting paragraph in here from him that I would like to read. And this is regarding the F1 engines. And I talked about the combustion instabilities of the chamber, and that because of the cooling system, they weren't able to maintain the proper temperatures. You have to have that cooling system working perfectly. And I'm pretty sure of this, that the only way to get the F1 engines to work in any semblance of perfection is to throttle back. Now, here's a very interesting conclusion from this author. Again, Eugene Reichel. And he says this about the F1 engine instabilities and the problems they were having. And I quote, "The spontaneous combustion instabilities never reappeared until the end. However, the problem was never completely understood." In other words, he's saying it right there. We fixed it, but we don't know how. Then he says, to this day, it remains a constant problem in large rocket engines for which an individual empirical solution has to be found. Now he's saying that, well, we fixed it then, but we don't know what the problem is now. And then he says, to the disappointment of the engineers, a model was never found which they could generally overcome the problem. That is regarding the F1 engines and the perfection that we are told worked to get the Apollo missions to the moon and back.
There's a massive amount of material there. I'd love to know what Blue thinks about this, because I know he has a different view.
First off, I truly do think that Randy's overplaying the tremendous failure that is Apollo 6, because it worked and mission was accomplished. They tested the engines, they tested the rocket and everything like that. It didn't reach its prime altitude, but that's not just because of the F1 engine's failures. That's because also the J2 engines had problems, and the engines after that. There was a lot of problems with that, but it still succeeded. And I don't see that as a problem for Apollo. In fact, I see that as just the opposite. We have problems like this all the time where we have to fix something really quickly, and then we don't get to test it before we go out and try to win a race. And it works a lot because we understand our engine very, very closely. And that's how these engineers understood each individual F1 engine. As you know, each individual F1 engine was not the same. They were all different, every one of them. And they had specific engineers assigned to each engine to keep them running. I could see that easily as one of the reasons why there's not a single model for all the F1 engines, because they're all different, even though they're manufactured basically the same. So I think that's just a problem that happens when you get very high-powered engines of really any kind. Another thing is, you were talking about how NASA doesn't admit that there was a problem with Apollo 6. Is that correct?
No, that's not what I said. I said NASA doesn't admit to problems with the F1 engines. I never said they didn't. They do admit to a problem with the
engines. All right. If you go to Huntsville, the Space Center, and they have a little booth there that specifically is about the problems of the F1 engine.
Right, and I just spoke to that problem, and I'd like to respond to your first point, is that what you're talking about is good. It's all well and good, and actually I agree with you to a point, but we're not talking about a history of engines leading up to high-powered engines. We're talking about a very unique engine, the F1 engine, that was only tested in actual conditions of flight twice for a total of 4 minutes. Technology, being what it is, always goes through peaks and valleys, and and there has to be always numerous testing done. We see this all the time in the aviation industry. So what I'm saying is that the problems that were admit to problems with the F1 engines, those problems were never retested again before the launch of Apollo 8. And I've never seen any example of that in any other industry where a problem is not fixed and then tested before an actual mission.
One, you said that the Apollo engines were only tested for 4 minutes in flight?
Hold on. Let's just clarify. They were actually tested for 70 hours in static testing. So 70 hours of testing, which seems adequate enough.
Can I just ask a question of clarification? Yeah. You refer to static testing. Now, is this, presumably this means that the rocket's not actually in flight when the engines are actually ignited?
Yeah, that's static testing. Now, static testing is important. I mean, in aviation, you have static testing of jet engines all the time. I mean, that's an integral part of any new technology. You want to do static testing first. And keep in mind is the static testing is done under very controlled conditions. The whole idea then, you take it to the next step. You want to test the aircraft engines in actual conditions of flight, and that is in atmospheric conditions, because now you've got many different forces that are acting on that engine. So you can have an engine working perfectly in static conditions, but now you want to see if that you can duplicate that in actual flight conditions. We're not seeing that with the F1 engines.
Why would you need it in that short amount of time? I mean, first off, when the Apollo 6 launched, if you were to have people in that capsule, they would have come home perfectly safe.
We were getting that information.
I'm getting that information from just basically estimates, seeing that it didn't blow up. The capsule did return pretty darn safely.
Hold on a second. I want to know how you came to that conclusion. The severe poker problems that were so bad it disrupted the fuel line and cut off the J2 engines. So how would they have gotten back safe?
It did damage the limb that was inside, the stand-in limb, and all that things. But the capsule in which the astronauts would have been housed in was perfectly fine.
Fine from where?
I can literally just show you a picture of it sitting on Earth right now.
No, I'm not talking about that. You can have a capsule that may look perfect, but we're talking about the contents of the capsule. what it would have done to the astronauts. Did they go into Earth orbit? Is that what you're saying? What?
It returned in good enough condition in which NASA decided, hey, it's fine that we can actually put people on this and try this again.
Okay, but what are you basing that on? That's what I need to know.
I'm basing that on in the events that happened. They launched a rocket.
Yeah.
It basically accomplished what they went for it to do.
Right.
Okay. It tested the engines. It tested the things. They figured out the problems that were on the rocket.
Right.
They know what the problems are. So then they go, this thing returns. We have a capsule sitting here. We have a deadline we got to make, and we have money. F1 engines cost a crap ton of money. These rockets cost just so much money. We have to send somebody up. It's logical for me that they would put somebody in the capsule, send it up, and send it back down when it was just proven that that could happen. And they have the few months to fix the next engines, make sure the problem doesn't happen again. And guess what? We saw that happen. We saw it happen. We saw the next rocket go up, Apollo 7, go up. They didn't have hardly any problems other than a cold and a small mutiny.
Apollo 7 was not a Saturn V launch.
You're right. But by the time they did send up the next Apollo rocket, there really weren't that many problems.
Okay. Sorry, are you done? I don't mean to interrupt you again.
Yeah, I'm done on this topic. I've got one more that I want to talk about with the sonic boom after this.
And I'll let you get to that in a second if you don't mind. I just want to respond to the first part. You're basing it on schedule. Is that what you said?
I'm basing it on what happened.
Okay, thank you.
So I know you want to talk about the sonic boom, Blue. But after that, I'll ask you. I've got another question for you after that about the other points. But do you want to mention the sonic boom issue?
Oh, yeah. So you were talking about how there's never been a sonic boom recorded. Is that what you were saying, Scott?
Yes, of course. You heard me. You can Google all you want. You won't find a video with a sonic boom in it.
If there wasn't a sonic boom, I'm kind of curious as to what you think that is. It looks like a sonic boom to me.
Well, give me the audio of it. That is a composite photograph you've just pulled up.
You're referring to the cloud of vapor about halfway up the rocket's body. Is that what you mean? Okay, cheers.
I can pull up pictures of other rockets doing sonic booms, and it looks the exact same.
Blue, now, Randy and Scott made other points as well. Now, earlier on, we were talking about Apollo 13 and the navigation issue, because this is something that came up on a previous episode of when Marcus and I and several other people were discussing this. What do you know about the navigation issue that Trevor brought up?
Not much, to be honest.
No worries. Yeah. Marcus, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just really looking at what we're discussing there, I think Randy's made some very good points in terms of testing, but also the use of the film, the IBM engineer's film, which I think we can all agree has been accepted as unedited, uncut. So it shows what actually happened. And to see the rocket moving through the cirrus clouds, where you can see its shadow being cast on the upper side of the cirrus cloud, means that you can time it very precisely. Now, if you're going to achieve a certain speed, you need a certain amount of power behind you, given the weight that you're carrying. And I usually say, well, you can take a Ford Fiesta with 100 horsepower, and it will get from 0 to 60 in, let's say, 10 seconds. You can take a Ferrari 358 with 400 horsepower, and it will get from 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, or maybe a bit less. The point is that it's the power that's available to do it that moves the weight that you're moving. The same would apply to a rocket. So if there isn't enough power to move it fast enough to reach the speed it has to achieve to get to its objective, which is cut-off point at 42 miles and then launching from there up to 118 miles, you need a certain amount of power. Now, if it didn't have the weight on the rocket because there wasn't enough fuel or the fuel was not sufficient, it wasn't carrying the weight we're told it carried into low Earth orbit and from then on into translunar injection, which is 46 tons to the moon. So what Randy, I think, has made a case for is that there wasn't sufficient power being generated by the F1 engines. We know what they're supposed to generate, but the question is, did they actually generate it? Did they generate the 1.5 million pounds of thrust each. And if, as you say, it was generating, say, 900,000 pounds per thrust, that means it didn't have the power to launch what we're told it launched. I think 50 years later, we're seeing the same problem with the Space Launch System. That is supposed to be able to launch the same weight, 130 tons, into low Earth orbit. You know, that's great advance in scientific achievement in the last 50 years, that they can't do any more than 130 tons. But that's beside the point. They still haven't launched the damn thing yet. So why don't they dig out the old Saturn V rockets? They've got an engine that Jeff Bezos dug out of the Atlantic, and just back engineer the thing. It can't be beyond the wit of man to do that. Because the Saturn V rocket, if it was as successful as we're told it was, would achieve what the Space Launch System is now designed to do. But if it couldn't do it, that would explain, A, why the shuttle had to be developed, because the thing couldn't lift the shuttle into low Earth orbit either. It took 10 years to get the shuttle program up and running. And why don't they just try to recreate some of what was successful with the Space Launch System? It's not making much sense. This is one of the major problems about what we discuss at considerable length and in some detail. It just doesn't make sense in terms of the 50 years of development which is supposed to have happened. Either NASA have gone backwards, which is a terrible indictment on them, or they never achieved what they said they achieved 50 years ago. We will soon find out if it was true or not, because President Trump doesn't like people who don't do what they say they will do, which is go back to the moon.
It does seem that progress reached a certain point. It happened very quickly within the first decade of the space race, and then it seemed to stop. Of course, there were deep space probes and things like that, and there was the International Space Station. The Russians put some people on orbiting platforms. But it wasn't what was predicted by space and science fiction and enthusiasts at the time. So that was a big disappointment. I'm sure anyone from that era who could see forward to the present day would gasp in dismay.
I think that the idea that technology has stagnated or NASA has gone backwards in technology is ridiculous. I mean, we're seeing ourselves putting incredible probes and rovers on Mars. We're seeing landing things on comets. The idea that we moved backwards is just insulting, honestly. The only reason why we're going back to the moon is so we can go to Mars, and we just got to the point where we have enough budget to even try that, and we know enough about Mars to even do it.
We're using Russian Soyuz rockets to send things up to the International Space Station.
The reason why we're using Soyuz rockets is because it's easy.
It's easy. So surely NASA technology would be far in advance of Russia.
We have the rocket that's cheap enough to do it. It's reliable enough to do it.
Because I thought your argument would be that NASA are so far in advance that they would be able to do it better than the Russians, surely.
Listen to me. Why would we be putting the massive amounts of resources in, which we did at one point? It's called the Space Shuttle, which Space Shuttle was more advanced than the Saturn V. But why would we be putting in all these resources when we have the practical use? We have the easy, cheapest way to get back and forth between the ISS for all the nations. And why would we be putting our resources there when we could put them other places? I don't understand why you expect us to be going to the moon in that period. I don't understand that.
Because I thought that the technology would be advanced enough to do it cheaply and more efficiently than the Russians would do it.
There's a couple of points I would like to address regarding what has been talked about. First of all, it's important to note that the United States government funds the ISS about, I think it's 3/4 to the other countries that are involved in that. So they're paying 3/4 the cost, which I think it's about $150 billion or 200 total, and I think the United States has put in $150 billion. And that's very interesting, and I think it's a very fair question to ask. Well, if you're putting that amount of money, which is equivalent to the money they spent on the alleged Apollo missions, I think it's a fair question to ask, why couldn't you set some of that money aside to build on the technology that we had 50 years ago to be able to get their own astronauts to the ISS? We're experiencing, as we speak, a lot of political instability between countries around the world, especially between Russia and the United States. and they wouldn't do this despite anyone, but at any point they can announce that they're ending their manned space program. So what happens to the ISS if that happens? Because if you have one country in the world that's using 50-year-old technology as its means to get to the space station, and that program ends, what happens to the ISS? And I think that's a fair question to ask, too.
To call the Soyuz rocket 50-year-old technology is basically like calling the Corvette a 60-year-old car. They keep doing advancements and they keep making it better and better and better. That's kind of the point of making the new rockets that keep going up to space. They didn't make 100 rockets 50 years ago and they're reusing those. Now, of course, they're going to be reusing parts. They're reusing the general idea of it. But the Soyuz rocket was a beautiful rocket. Even 50 years ago, it was incredible. It got the job done very well. So I don't expect there to be a lot of stuff.
Why haven't the Russians put man on moon?
The Russians didn't put a man on the moon because they didn't try to put a man on the moon. Yeah, they had the massive triangle cone-looking rocket that they launched once and it utterly failed. But they never put any research into science.
So surely they would have a better way of getting man on the moon.
Yeah, because they got freaking lucky.
Lucky.